I think we're ready to get going with the crowd that we've had join. We'll probably have another few filter in as we go along, but I'm happy to get going now. Well, everyone, welcome to the latest of our Fire Faculty Network webinars. I'm Peter Bonilla. I am Vice President of Programs at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. Among my work is managing a lot of our faculty development and faculty programming, part of which includes these webinars. I'm very happy to have Sean Stevens with us this afternoon, giving a similar webinar to the one he did last year. It's hard to believe that year has already flown past. But today we're going to be talking about the latest version of FIRE's college free speech rankings. Very happy to have Sean Stevens with us as one of our resident researchers in data and polling, someone who's been with FIRE for a couple of years now, who was a lead researcher on this year's project as well as in 2020, the first year we piloted this project. So Sean, welcome. And maybe before we get into your presentation, would you mind for the attendees who might be new to this project of ours, just giving a little bit of background on the project generally, how we started out in 2020 and how that evolved to the project as it is now?
Yeah, I would actually say it goes back maybe more to like 2019 or so is kind of when the planning and discussions for it started. That was when it was kind of a joint effort with Real Clear Education, FIRE, College Pulse. I at the time was at Heterodox Academy and was also helping with like designing the questions, like kind of deciding what topic areas to focus on and then designing the questions. So that meeting was back in like May of 2019. And so it's kind of been it's actually been a long running project that finally came to fruition in 2020. And then we really expanded it last year, tripling in size, the number of universities we surveyed. And we're going to add probably another 40 or 50 for next year's version. So we'll be up to about 200 schools.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Sean. Well, nothing further for me at the outset, other than to say for those who have joined us, we will have, I think, plenty of time for question and answer. We're giving this session an hour and 15 minutes as opposed to the usual hour. So the question and answer field should be open. Feel free to drop in your questions anytime you like. I know I've got a few of my own that I'm really interested to hear Sean's answers on. But feel free to add your questions anytime. But we should get to the end of this with at least, I think, a good 20 or 30 minutes to take your questions. So Sean, with that, feel free to take it away from here.
Yeah, can you let me share the screen?
Yes, I sure can.
There we go. I got it.
Okay.
Okay. So, just a little bit of background is that the goal of this project is to offer parents, prospective students, administrators, interested faculty, basically anyone interested in culture of free speech, free expression on campus. We want to give them, in a sense, a comprehensive way to assess each of these campuses, right? So we kind of hope that they help those target groups better understand how students are experiencing free expression on campus. And we really think that obtaining campus-specific data is important because each campus faces its unique challenges. Prior research that focused on specific campuses can show kind of some wide swings or big differences between them. When we analyze differences on schools in both the 2020 survey and 2021, we can find big differences between schools that are, not even a mile apart, like Columbia and Barnard. There's a recent piece in Real Clear Education on that. And if you're interested in kind of looking at what the overall rankings are, or even diving into some of the details of the questions and exploring the data more, while we're doing this presentation, you could go to speech.collegepulse.com. That'll bring you to the main rankings page. To explore the data, I think you might have to enter your email address, but that'll get you into the kind of the back end where you can slice it by school, you can slice the questions by conference, you can look at overall responses, things like that. So if you're interested in doing that, you can go to that website. Okay, so just a little bit of background on fielding of the survey. We collected the data from February 15th to May 30th of 2021. Individual campuses were surveyed in tighter windows. Campuses were kind of targeted at different points in the semester. So on each individual campus, the survey probably ran for something like 10 days to about 2 weeks. The data comes from 37,104 full-time undergraduate students enrolled at 4-year programs from 159 different colleges. The sample was drawn from College Pulse's American College Student Panel, which is basically adjusted and weighted based on data from the current population survey and from the IPEDS database at the National Center for Education Statistics. So we have a national weight when we look at the responses of all 37,000 students, and we have a weight specific to each school when we do analyses on that school. I'll point out that while we surveyed 159 different colleges, 5 of those received FIRE's warning rating. The decision was made to present their scores, but they don't receive a ranking because effectively they do not promise free expression, and they explicitly, in some cases, explicitly say that they prioritize other values over it. So we feel it's like their scores will be presented, but we actually only gave rankings to 154 of the schools. Okay. So our key findings are Claremont McKenna obtained the highest score in 2021. University of Chicago was second. They were number 1 overall previously in 2020. And then the University of New Hampshire, Emory, and Florida State round out the top 5. Some other schools that placed in or around the top 10 include UCLA, George Mason, Arizona State, University of Arizona, University of Mississippi, University of Florida. On the flip side, DePaul University had the lowest score in the free speech rankings. This is for the 2nd year in a row. Marquette, LSU, Boston College, and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute are also near the bottom of the rankings. And all 4 of those schools, if you explore FIRE's website, have a kind of decent history of controversies over free expression, and we've had a decent amount of history with them. So it was not necessarily surprising to see them wind up more towards the bottom. In terms of data points, 83% of students reported self-censoring, not expressing their views because they were concerned what other students, a professor or an administrator would react, like how they would react to them. So 83% of them said they did this at least some of the time. Options raised from never to fairly often. And then roughly 1 in 5 said they censor themselves fairly or very often. Okay. Students identified racial equality as the most difficult topic to discuss on campus. This was over 50% of students identified this. Other topics that were identified by a high percentage of students, like 45 to 50%, included abortion, gun control, transgender issues, and George Floyd protests. And then finally, more than 1/3 of students, or less than 1/3, sorry, less than 1/3 of students, slightly, agree that college administration makes it either very or extremely clear to them that they will protect free speech on campus. I'm going to return later to a little bit more about the administrative component and the role that the administration can play in setting a culture on campus and its impact on our rankings. We found some interesting findings there. So it's also some changes from last year. We repeated a handful of the questions. So I'm only going to talk about the ones that we repeated and have identical wording and identical response options. So 2 in 5 students said they were comfortable, so somewhat or very comfortable, publicly disagreeing with a professor. That's down 5 percentage points from last year when 45% said they would do so, felt comfortable doing so. 2/3 of students said it was acceptable to shout down a speaker to prevent them from speaking on campus, and that's up from 62% last year. And then almost 1 in 4 say it's acceptable to some degree to use violence to stop a campus speech, and that's up 5 percentage points from last year's 18%. And so on that last figure, the response options are always acceptable, sometimes acceptable, rarely acceptable, and never acceptable. And this also applies to the 66% factor too. Those 2 percentages, 66% and 23%, come from summing always, sometimes, and rarely together. We think never is the ideal response option for both of these things, and we see that as kind of a difference of kind and not degree. So that's basically 1 in 4 said to some degree, and the modal response was rarely, for sure. But 1 in 4 basically say it's acceptable to some degree for students to use violence to stop a speech. Okay. So the rankings themselves, they're made up of 7 components. 6 of them come from the survey, and then the 7th is FIRE speech code ratings. So the average overall score was 59.53. Standard deviation was 3.81. Claremont McKenna came in at number 1 with 72.27. And as I mentioned, DePaul had the lowest score with 50.8. Okay. So now each of these components, I'm going to kind of go through our results of them individually on the coming slides, but I'll say a little bit about each one. The comfort expressing ideas component asks a series of questions about student comfort level expressing their views in different contexts on campus. So this includes disagreeing with the professor. This includes saying a controversial political view in class. We ask about their comfort expressing themselves just in general in public space on campus and social media as well. That component also includes our self-censorship question, which asks about how often students have self-censored on campus. Openness is a checklist item type of question where we ask students to select up to 15 topics that they find difficult to have an open and honest conversation about. None of the above is also an option. Only roughly like 10 to 12% of students selected that as an option. So the majority of students are selecting at least one of those topics, if not more. Next 2 components are tolerance for controversial speakers. So we have 4 speakers that are effectively arguing a controversial liberal viewpoint. So an example of this would be the police should be abolished because they are racist. And on the flip side, we have 4 speakers that are arguing a controversial conservative viewpoint. So an example of one of those is abortion should be made completely illegal. We have 2 items that assess administrative support for free speech. This is effectively how the students perceive the administration. So I mentioned that they're asked how clear it is that the administration makes it to them that they will defend free speech. And they're also asked about the likelihood of defending a speaker's rights if a controversy developed. Okay. The disruptive conduct component includes the shout down and violence questions, as well as a question asking how acceptable it is for students to block entry to a speaking event. And then as I mentioned, finally, the last component is FIRE speech code ratings, of which there are 4. There's green light, which conveys that there are no clear policies on the books that infringe on free speech. It doesn't necessarily mean it's guaranteed on that campus, but it effectively is an indicator that we don't see any problematic policies there that administrators could arbitrarily apply. A yellow light is there's at least 1 or more ambiguous policies that could be arbitrarily applied and threaten free speech and expression. And red means there's clear policies on the books that come as a violation of this. And that's in effect, we're saying you might be likely to encounter a problem if you find yourself in a controversy on campus. And I mentioned before, warning schools, that's the 4th rating. They effectively do not promise or guarantee free expression on campus. They prioritize other values over that, so they are assigned that rating. Okay, so just now kind of going to go through our basic top line results here, and then we'll get a little bit into the importance of administrative support and some interesting findings involving student viewpoint diversity and how that impacts student experience on campus. So on self-censorship, here's our self-censorship question. So people are asked, how often have you felt that you could not express your opinion on a subject because of how students, a professor, or the administration would respond? And so as we can see, only 17% said never. That could even potentially be somewhat high. I think most people probably have self-censored like at least once. And as we see, as you go up, I mean, the modal responses are more rarely and occasionally, but there is that kind of 21% that say they're doing this fairly or very often. And that's 21, no, remind everyone, that's 21% of 37,000 students that we surveyed. So the actual raw number there is a decent number of students on these campuses. We also follow that question up with an open-ended response question asking students to share a moment where they felt they could not express their opinion on campus. This was not asked of the students who said that they never self-censored. So it's only if they said rarely or the more frequent options. So this is just a smattering of quotes ranging across the ideological spectrum. So I'm kind of trying to demonstrate that this isn't like it's one-sided problem. So I have a very liberal student at Georgia Tech who says working for the student newspaper has been a struggle because we aren't totally independent. We still use school funds for printing. And I feel like I can't say everything I want to in op-ed pieces because of admin. Sophomore at University of Pennsylvania who's liberal. This type of scenario occurs most often when the university does not make an official statement and therefore allows the student body or groups on campus to control the narrative. Criticizing the president's actions in any way is frowned upon and oftentimes will be shut down. It's a slightly liberal student from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I need to move the screen slightly so I can see this last quote. Some teachers here are very leftist. I am moderate, but still feel if I do not write my homework in a more leftist view, then I will get a bad grade. So this is a moderate from Marquette. And I'd like to point out here that with these three liberal students, the quotes, they're kind of focusing on the administration. And when that seems to be a more common theme among more liberal students. And then when you shift over to the conservative side of the spectrum, you tend to start seeing, you see criticisms of the administration, but you also start seeing concern about lower grades from the professors. And you see more of a focus on a lack of viewpoint diversity on campus, and particularly among the faculty. So these four remaining quotes are, this is a moderate from University of Illinois at Chicago. When I'm having political discussions with friends in the library or dining hall, I feel as if I have to talk quietly so that people do not hear me. Sophomore from University of Colorado is slightly conservative. Right-wing opinions are not allowed, including criticism of the coronavirus response by the University of Colorado. The administration works very hard to make sure you cannot express your views. They are all for supporting the students as long as it is within their view. That's a conservative student from University of Nevada. And then finally, during an election cycle or about anything political, because there's so much hatred and backlash against anyone with a different opinion, it's a very conservative student from Case Western Reserve University. So, most of these focus on the admin. That's thematic because of what I'm going to kind of get to later on that. But yeah, I'll reiterate that kind of interesting thing we noticed in kind of we're still going through. There's about 15,000 of these open-ended responses. So we're still digging through them. But liberal students, I'll reiterate, tend to really focus more on administrators and the administration and how they censor speech, or they don't listen to the concerns of the students. And conservative students tend to focus more on lack of viewpoint diversity on campus, concern about being punished for their views by the professor and the administration, things like that. Okay. The remaining items of the comfort expressing ideas component. So as I said, self-censorship item is included in the comfort expressing ideas component. The remaining ones ask about contexts. Right? And so we could see, from this graph, blue is uncomfortable, green is comfortable. Students are fairly comfortable expressing their views on controversial topics in common campus spaces. So we gave them examples like the quad, the dining hall, the lounge. That's over 60% of students saying that they feel comfortable doing that. Probably would like that to be higher, but it's a good start. They also feel comfortable expressing disagreement with professors in a written assignment. So this is interesting because as we go down the list, we'll see that one of the biggest concerns is publicly disagreeing with a professor. So there seems to be this contrast between there's more comfort doing this in private when perhaps only the professor is the only other person seeing it, compared to in public where you're saying it and now it's not just that the professor, but other people hear your speech or your expression. Third, bringing, about 50% of students say they feel comfortable expressing their views on a controversial political topic in class. So it's about half then say that they do not. And then the two that make up the greatest percentage of students who say they're uncomfortable is expressing unpopular opinion to fellow students on social media. I don't think that's necessarily very surprising. However, I think that's a question we will continue to weave in because it would be a positive to see that go down in future years. And then as I mentioned, publicly disagreeing with a professor about a controversial topic was the context that students were most uncomfortable presenting their views in. Okay. On our 15 topics where students were asked if they could have an open and honest conversation about them, you can see, as I mentioned, racial inequality, abortion, gun control, George Floyd protests, and transgender issues were identified by over 40% of students. As we then go down the list, we're getting into, 35 to 40%, and even down to China, social media deplatforming, and climate change, we're getting roughly 20% of students saying so there. It's interesting to note that, two of the 5 issues, I think, deal with racial inequality. You could probably consider the George Floyd protests a more specific example of that topic to one degree. And then you bring in, there's transgender issues, and gender inequality is also an issue identified by a good percentage of students here. These are the topics, I think, that are not just dominating a lot of discourse on campus, that they're starting to be almost some of the main discourse off campus and the main sources of controversy off campus. So it's just interesting to note, to see that we've picked up on this for a few years with these kind of items and issues like this. And it seems to be playing out that what happens on campus is now kind of more leaking out into the real world and having its impacts there. We'll return to this a little later. These issues will focus on racial inequality, abortion, and gun control, because depending on the dominant ideological viewpoint on campus, we will see that different students feel more or less open or less able to have conversations about those topics. I focused mainly on those 3 because they were the ones identified as by most students. Okay, support for our controversial speakers here. So again, blue is opposition to these speakers, green is supporting. And so this just focuses on strong opposition and strong support. But I'll point out that overall, only 3 of these 8 speakers were supported by majority of the students. So 5 of them didn't even obtain 50% support, and a few of them were opposed by over 70% of the students. So those top 3 were abortion should be completely illegal, transgender people have a mental disorder, and Black Lives Matter is a hate group, all faced fierce opposition from students. These speakers are admittedly pretty offensive and controversial, but that is the point with items like this. These are modeled off of the typical Stauffer method questions from the General Social Survey, which, the argument has been made that over time, some of those targets have become more accepted in society, so that they're not actually as charged enough for some people. So it's like you're basically asking someone, do you tolerate something that you already tolerate? These questions are designed to be offensive because we want to know if students can tolerate things they disagree with. I will emphasize that the prompt for this made it very clear that we are asking about their support or opposition, regardless of whether they agree with the viewpoint or not. So it was clear that we were asking them about, should people be allowed to invite this type of speaker to campus, regardless of what you think about them. Like, regardless of your view, you're not agreeing with this view if you indicate that you support someone's ability to invite these speakers. So we think this is a very good measure of political tolerance. Some of these items may change next year because they probably have kind of passed out of the public consciousness. But this they will simply be replaced by other speakers that we think will be kind of offensive to one side of the aisle or the other. Here's our administrative support questions now. So there's 2. Okay, as I said, it's how clear is it to you the administration protects free speech on campus? And then if a controversy over speech erupts or were to occur on campus, how likely is it they would defend the speaker's views? Both of these look fairly normally distributed, actually. So I think what I take out of this is the administration could do a lot better. Most students are basically saying it's kind of murky. Like, it's not that clear what you would do, like if you protect speech or not. And we're not really sure if you would defend the speaker in a controversy. It's kind of like, maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. And we think that kind of ambiguity is not good for the expression climate. And to go into kind of, I've been mentioning the administrative support factor is really important, said it a few times. When we did effect size analyses on the different components. So of course, all of these components are going to be correlated with the overall score. They are components of the overall score. However, administrative support had the highest correlation. It's about twice as big as the next component, which was comfort expressing ideas. The effect sizes associated with administrative support, when we translated them into Cohen's D and then a common language effect size, so where we can represent it more as a percentage and it's kind of easier to wrap your head around and understand, indicated that if you had an above average score on administrative support, you had a 75%, roughly 75% chance of also having an above average overall score. So we think this component is very important, and this is something that colleges can directly do and directly influence, because the administration can take clear public stances that they support free speech. They can make a public effort to change their speech codes that are on the books that might be giving them a red or yellow light rating. Presumably students would notice that. They can make a very clear public defense of speakers who come under fire on their campus for expressing their views. These are things that administrators can do themselves, whereas the other components are likely a little bit trickier to wave a magic wand about. And it's like, making people tolerant of ideas they disagree. And there's long-standing evidence from about 7 decades that most people are pretty tolerant in the abstract. When asked, do you support free speech? Do you think everyone should have a right to express their ideas? People say yes, but when you're then told, well, they're going to say this, a lot of people are like, no way, I don't want that person talking at all. I don't think they should be allowed to express their views. So this component is something that schools can directly kind of influence now, we think, whereas other components probably take a more concerted long-term effort to improve those things among the student body. Final component, disruptive conduct. So this is just presenting the percentages of students that selected each option. And so as I'll note, the modal responses to these are generally rarely or never acceptable. So that is a positive. It's certainly positive that very few students say it's always acceptable to block entry and it's always acceptable to shout speakers down. And basically none of them say violence is always acceptable. But what I think this slide captures well, and I've said this in some previous presentations and just public comments about this, is the percentages of people that are in like the sometimes and even the rarely acceptable category are maybe providing like some intellectual justification or rationalization or support for the very few percentage of people who might actually really engage in these behaviors. And that comes out of counterterrorism research and research on political radicalization. It's a theory known as the pyramid of radicalization. And the argument is that the tip of the pyramid, while very small, that's where you're going to find the people who are most likely to become radicalized, most likely to use violence. But just beneath that is this foundation that's much broader. And the argument is that group of people does provide, in a sense, cover for the tip of the spear or the tip of the pyramid. So I think that these figures might be capturing some of that. Okay, so I kind of mentioned this as well. This is all based on self-identification from students. We ask them to identify their political ideology. The options range from very liberal to very conservative. There's a haven't thought much about this option. There's I don't know. There's something else that you could write in, but the majority of students, not surprisingly, identified somewhere on the 7-point scale as either very somewhat or slightly liberal, moderate, very somewhat slightly conservative. For simplicity's sake, liberal encompasses all 3 of those terms. Conservative encompasses the other 3 ends of the spectrum. Moderate is just the moderate campus. What I'm showing here is of the 159 campuses that we surveyed. So this is all 159. 144 of them were you could classify as liberalism or left-leaning views were dominant among the student body. And so by dominant, I mean the percentage of students identifying liberal was more than 5% in either of the other two categories. Like the difference between them was more than 5%. In some cases, it was very stark. We had some schools with discrepancies like 70 to 10, even like 80% to 5, things like that. Mixed schools basically was these schools are within 5% of each other in terms of how students are identifying as either liberal or conservative. There were 8 of those, and then 7 conservative schools. It's kind of the flip side of the liberal school argument. It's schools where the difference between liberal and conservative students favored conservatives by more than 5%. The majority of our warning schools fell in that category, and a few other kind of larger state universities in the southern US. So what we can see here, I think, is this is the self-censorship question sliced by what the dominant viewpoint is on campus. And we can see that on liberal campuses, a very few percentage of liberal students say that they self-censor fairly or very often, but there's a lot of conservative students that say so. As we go down kind of the aisle, as we get to moderate campuses, it starts to even out a little more, but it's actually over 20% of liberal students on moderate campuses there, or mixed campuses, say they self-censor often. So that's almost roughly about twice as much as, on the liberal campuses. And then when we go to conservative campuses, we see conservatives still are more likely to self-censor. It's really not by that much. I think it's about a 3 percentage points difference. It's like 15% of liberals say so, 18% of conservatives. On the whole, I think this suggests that perhaps conservative students in general are just more likely to say they self-censor regardless of the viewpoints, the dominant view on campus. But it does show that they have a much more heightened sense of concern about this when they know they're in the clear ideological minority. On the flip side, it looks like the mixed campuses give the most trouble to liberal students, and they are less likely to express their views in those. And I mean, that's still, 20% is, sure, it's not terribly high, but if we keep in mind that, again, going back to just our overall sample size of 37,000, and that roughly 60% of the students identified as liberal, that 20% still represents a lot of students. So that's a lot of students on the left who are saying, I self-censor because of the climate on campus. Okay. And finally, this is our percentage of students identifying abortion, gun control, and racial inequality as topics that are difficult to discuss, again, sliced by the campus. I think this slide makes the point better than the last one about the importance of the dominant viewpoint on campus. As we look at each of these issues, as we move from left to right, like liberal mixed to conservative, we see that blue bar go up, in some cases by a lot, and we see the red bar go down. The purple bars seem to kind of fluctuate and stay the same. There's not like too much difference between them, and they seem very similar across campuses, but there's a clear pattern, I think, here with liberal students as you move left to right, and conservative students as you move left to right on these campuses. And so I think the impact or the importance of how students are perceiving where their viewpoints are, whether they're in the majority or minority, has something to do with how these schools are performing. I think this also supports arguments that come from communication and spiral of silence theory. It's pretty much hits you in the eyes when you see this one. Okay. Last few slides. And this is kind of where, we'd love to hear thoughts on these questions that I have up here or others, because we think there's a lot more we can do with these rankings as we continue to collect data. And so one question that's been on our mind, and we've started to kind of look at, is do schools with more viewpoint diversity among the students and maybe even the faculty perform better in the rankings? Is there a way to incorporate this into how we calculate the overall score, and basically reward schools where students who are in the minority report that they are still comfortable expressing their views? We think that would be a very interesting feature and potential component to the rankings, but there's a lot of different ways one could go about doing that. Other things we thought about doing is do schools that employ specific programs, so specific freshman orientation modules, like Purdue, about 5 or 6 years ago, introduced a free speech First Amendment section of their orientation. Do schools that do things like that perform better overall? As we continue to collect data each year, if a school introduces one of these kinds of programs, or one or more of these programs, do we see performance improving in the overall rankings after those programs are introduced, right? And these are like blocking variables. We simply need to know if a school has this program or not. You could drop that into the data file and we can start looking at how they perform. Third one, it's kind of similar to, I guess, the second one, but it's like, does a specific controversy that occurred maybe in a single year or in a semester where it's salient, does that have some kind of impact on a school's rankings? So, examples of this could be the Son of Sam statue debate that occurred at University of North Carolina a few years ago. That still was mentioned. That was mentioned a lot in the open-ended comments in 2020. Still was mentioned a decent amount in the open-ended comments in 2021 by students from UNC. Other things that came up in there were on a number of campuses, there are local preachers that effectively just come on to the quad and start speaking about abortion. And they have obviously a very pro-life stance. Number of students mentioned that being intimidating or something that they didn't like about the campus and made it feel like that they couldn't express alternative views when that was going on. It's like, so did these specific controversies, other ones could be like some of these faculty member controversies that we've started tracking with our Scholars Under Fire database, if that becomes a kind of newsworthy story that a lot of people are aware of and it becomes a big issue on campus, do we see something happening to student responses in the school's overall ranking? So these and others are things we'd love to kind of get into and think about as future directions for the rankings. And then finally, just some conclusions. Outside of a handful of schools, large public state universities made up almost the entire top 25. We saw a similar pattern last year. I mean, I would cut it more off at like the top 10 and not the top 25, because top 25 last year would be almost half the schools. But we saw this pattern last year as well, that larger state colleges appeared to do better on average than smaller schools, smaller private schools. Last year we really only surveyed one liberal arts college, that's DePaul. This year we have over 20. So we're starting to see this pattern where students at liberal arts colleges are saying that the campus expression climate is not terribly great at most of them. So the exceptions to this were UChicago, Emory, and Duke, even though those three are they're private, but they do have fairly large student bodies. So in fact, actually the only real exception to this point was Claremont McKenna, which is a small liberal arts college with roughly around 2,000 students. I think it's actually even a little bit less than that. So we think this suggests that these larger student bodies might make it either harder for students to feel intimidated if they have views that are outside the mainstream, or what's probably even more likely is there's going to be people on that campus, but just by the sheer volume or number of people, there are likely to be other like-minded people on campus that you can find and feel comfortable expressing your views around. And the other main point, just to hammer home, the leadership's attitude appears to be very important. The administrative component has the second lowest impact on the overall score. The only thing that has less of an impact is the fire rating. All of the other things count for more points. So this component basically was so highly correlated with performance, and we saw that above average scores on it really do predict above average scores overall. We think it's really important, and that there might be there's a lot more administrators can do on their campus to improve matters in this issue. And we're kind of really calling on administrators to step up and do this. The ball is in their court. Fire's happy to help them with this. We have tons of resources, the policy team that would basically help you revise policies that are bringing your ranking down. The suggestion is simply make this clear to the students that you're making this push. The students need to be aware of it. They need to see it. They need to feel confident that you're going to defend their rights in a controversy and other people's rights. So that's about all we have in terms of presenting data on the survey and some kind of newer and interesting findings. So really happy to, I'm sure Peter has like some closing remarks or two, but happy to kind of get the Q&A going, get some ideas going on some of those future directions, or answer additional questions that anyone might have.
I don't really have closing remarks, although I will say, I think with you made a mention of the UNC controversy. I think you meant the Silent Sam statue.
Oh, sorry.
not the
Yeah,
Son-
sorry.
That would be
That's Son of
quite a
Sam.
thing if a public university had a statue of the Son of Sam on their campus. That would really get some discussions going. I would indeed be quite curious to know what the effect on the local free speech climate would be.
Yeah, that's a symptom of living in the New York area my whole life. So kind of confuse those two.
I'll just ask this one question, and then we'll throw it over, and we'll let the discussion go where it may. But it was one of the last points you made, Sean, about about the effect that administrative support for free expression has. Is that something that we can say with a little more confidence this year than last year, after having done these surveys twice, having surveyed a much larger sample of institutions? I'm trying to remember the discussion we had on this last year, and I feel like this is a point where we're more emphatic on second time around. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, I think we made this point last year as well, but more along the lines of just applying the findings that we have. It was kind of a, well, what's the low-hanging fruit that a college could do
right
immediately that might lead to some improvement as we continue to do these rankings? And it, it was administrative. It's kind of administrators, hey, show your students where you stand on this issue. This year, I think we're more confident in really saying that. We've kind of dug more into the data on it. We surveyed 3 times as many campuses.
Yep.
I think there's a repeated pattern in both years where the schools that did well, like a number of the schools that did well, especially this year, have a history of administrators making very clear public statements about where they stand on free expression. Carmel McKenna, UChicago, Purdue, all of them have done that, as well as some others that are in the top 10 and top 25. And on the flip side, it's, as I mentioned, like the lower ranked schools, some of the ones near the bottom have historically been some of the biggest offenders when you go back over Fire's news stories. Also, most of the warning schools are, if they were assigned a ranking, like if you look at what their overall scores are, if they did get assigned a ranking, they would be ranked quite low. Baylor would be like the second lowest school. And most of them, I think, would be below like 145th, something like that. So we think, that I think also is a testament to, like, I think we stand by our policy ratings, the traffic light spotlight ratings. They also seem to be picking up on something where schools that we basically say, like, yeah, you probably don't want to go here if you actually really prioritize this value.
Right.
Most of them didn't do very well. On any of the components. It's not just like the fire rating.
I'm trying to think back, and we've had a couple very good questions come in, so I'm going to get right to those. But I'm thinking back a few weeks ago, Sean, we were both in Chicago at our faculty network conference, and you got me thinking a little bit about Purdue. And I know we had, he's not, I don't see him here, so I'm not gonna, well, obviously put him on the spot or anything, but I do recall that we had someone at our conference who had subjected the use of our First Amendment orientation materials to some analysis in terms of whether it helped stem future controversies. And I think he found that there was some evidence that it had, or at least that there were fewer of certain types of complaints.
It's a great, it was a great finding. It effectively is, once that was instituted, and I believe that was instituted in 2016. So 2016 to present, Purdue has received 0 student complaints about preachers on campus. They used to receive somewhere around 75 to 100 a year, and it went to 0. And I stress student complaints because they haven't received 0 complaints
Right.
since 2016. They've received complaints from parents and alumni, but not necessarily the students themselves. And so I think that is a pretty clear testament that that program has had an effect.
Yeah. That's it's a great finding. I agree, and I think I'm going to have to find a way to bring that professor back so I can share his findings with a few more people, because yeah, I think it speaks well of the campus, but I think it does provide some some actual results that we can go on. You never quite know in terms of having measurable data how much good some of these programs are amounting to. That data is often just elusive. So to have that is really very useful. I'll put a pin in that, but I'm going to try and find a way to get that to more of our faculty, because I think it's really useful stuff. Okay, I'm going to get to the questions I've had come in, and we can go a little bit more into just the insights from the data and what we can do with that. But a question we've had: is there any way to analyze the category of openness to discussion for intersectionality between topical areas? So I'm guessing, I hope I'm not putting words in the professor's mouth, but if we're able to pinpoint where it swings back and forth based on what the topic is.
I mean, I think so that would involve, not all of these topics obviously would, I think, fall under the umbrella of intersectionality, like, and addressing that as a thing. So it would involve identifying which topics do.
Yeah, I think well,
inequality ones probably do.
I've had a follow-up, specifically, I think that the professor is wondering about racial and gender issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we could kind of zero in and focus on those topics and kind of see where the cleavages might be with students reacting. We didn't find many. There's some gender differences that can be fairly stark on some of these, but we didn't last year I think we found some more interesting racial differences. We didn't find too many racial ethnic differences that kind of jumped out at us with the data this year, but there's more sophisticated ways, I think, to slice it and look at this, right? We could look at some of the subtopic selection, like a selection of some of these topics, and one could consider size of the university, whether it's public or private, whether it's liberal art versus a state college or a larger just university, because that might help us identify. It might be that at some campuses, these topics aren't necessarily that controversial, or that students feel comfortable discussing them, but then at other types, they have much more difficulty. And so I mean, that's a great idea. And that's one way I think we could try to get at that through the data. There's other, I think, some of the controversial speaker questions might help us get at that as well, as they kind of deal with racial, and I mean, they definitely deal with racial issues. Yeah, and we could include the abortion question as well and kind of look at that. And on those, on the abortion question, there's a clear gender difference for sure. So I think it's possible, yes.
Sean, this brings up another broader question, just in terms of the data file itself. I know we're still going through it on our end. I think you mentioned we have, we're reading our way through 15,000 individual long form responses from the students.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the data file, in terms of accessibility, in terms of its use as a tool for other people to analyze, other researchers to dive into and see what they might get from it. Can you just talk a little bit about the prospects for that?
Oh yeah, we're happy to make the data available. What we've been doing so far with these requests is we send all the survey responses with the demographics that College Pulse collected. There's a guide, so what the numbers in the file mean, what does 1 equal for this question, etc. So we've already shared this with a handful of people. The one thing that this file doesn't include is the open-ended comments, because we've as Peter mentioned, we're still going through them. We're going through them to remove comments that contain like either remove or redact certain comments, because some of them contain identifying information where the student says something like, I'm president of this I'm currently president of this organization, and you know what school they're at. So you can clearly identify this person if you just do a little digging. So we're kind of removing those. Some of the students didn't want to actually leave an open-ended comments. So they basically wrote gibberish into the text box. So we're kind of like, these aren't really helpful. So we're removing those. So yes, we're very happy to share the data, and that there's no issue doing that. It just wouldn't include the open-ended comments. If you're interested in a specific school, however, and seeing the comments from a specific school, we can do that. And we've done that in a few cases as well, because we've decided, okay, we'll go through the comments from this specific school, we'll de-identify them, and then we'll send them along. So long-winded way of getting to the answer is yes, we're happy to share this with kind of anyone who's interested.
Great, thank you, Sean. Another good question I've had come in. Question: of the top performing schools in the category of large state and public institutions, is there any correlation between their free speech performance and their likely oversight by boards of regents or partisan dominated state legislatures?
Great question. We haven't looked at that yet. So that's, I guess, something we could kind of build into our data set and do. But I don't have an answer to that yet. We haven't looked at that, but that's a great idea.
I would definitely like to see how they come. There's an extent to which you can see how certain flagships come in the rankings. The University of Wisconsin has always, that has always, been an institution, particularly where there's been a lot of political jockeying over the years. We've seen similar down in the University of North Carolina system. For people who've been watching, the University of Florida has been mired in controversy over over the institution. It's reversed itself now, but over the institution's blocking of 3 professors from testifying in a voting rights lawsuit against the state. And there's all kinds of I don't know how much grounds there is to them. I'm not that versed on it, but there's all kind of questions abound, and not for bad reasons, about the extent to which the institution might be getting pressured from the state. So I agree. It's definitely something that I would love to see more on. So that may be, not to create work for our research team, but that may be one of the areas where we do a little bit of digging.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great, we're happy. I think we're happy to do things like that. This is the idea of, like I mentioned, there's like these variables out there that it's like, we can put them we could code them into the data set and try to dig and see if all these things that people think work actually maybe have some kind of effect. So yeah, I'm very happy to do that and hear other suggestions on things we could do that are like that.
Great. A question, that's something I was wondering. Going through the the reporting we've done on it, following your slides along. I know there were a couple of measures where things seemed a little bit worse from a free speech perspective in terms of support of certain things. Were there any factors or any data points where we saw improvement that you can think of?
So, one thing to note, I would note, it's we did put a lot of effort into, I think we improved a lot of our questions this year off of last year's. We really approached last year's as interesting and great as it was. It was like a beta test launch almost. Sure. And so it is difficult to kind of draw too many comparisons for, I think, a couple of reasons. It's like, we surveyed 3 times as many schools. So I wouldn't want to, focus on, for instance, my graduate school alma mater, Rutgers, did kind of well last year, and then now is down around number 100. But it's kind of like, well, the rankings are relative to who was surveyed. So by adding more schools, that may be why they're lower. Maybe we just didn't survey enough schools last year for this to show up. So unless like, I think comparing like Chicago did great both years, like, that's good, but a school that kind of dropped in the rankings compared to last year, I wouldn't want to focus too much on that because I don't think it's really fair to. So there's that aspect. With looking at trends in the questions, yeah, it looks bad because I would say it looks bad when you look at, say, the self-censorship item, because last year we had something like 60% of students said that they did that, but last year it was a yes/no question. So this year we changed it to a frequency question, and we got 17% of students said never. So that means 83% say they did to some extent. That sounds like a really big change, but we didn't ask the same question really. Like, we gave them more response options. We gave them kind of more ability to gauge, it wasn't a dichotomous bucket. So outside of, I think, the questions where we basically have the same wording, it's tough to track trends. We are keeping most of these questions for next year. So I think once we have next year's data, we'll feel a lot more confident talking about those kinds of effects. Yeah, I think that's, I don't think we saw much improvement in some of the comfort items that we repeated. Like the social media one was basically the same as last year. It's like 60% of students roughly said that last year too.
Yeah,
we did ask students if they were taking courses, like almost with all their courses online versus in person. And for students that said they had never, for students that had experience taking an in-person class and now were primarily online, what we found was a notable portion, it wasn't a majority, but a notable portion said it was more difficult to express themselves online. It was something like 40% or so said that. It was something like 25 or 30 said it was easier. And then the rest was people who said it's about the same.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one more, but we've had a couple more good questions come in, so I'm not going to take too much of your time. But something I'm always wondering, and you're a social scientist and a researcher, so you felt this pain of seeing the gap between what a study actually says and how it is getting reported. We love juicy data points, we love juicy tidbits. But is there anything or any interesting findings that you think have been sort of underreported or that you think don't have been fully appreciated by some of the coverage and the responses?
Yeah, so I kind of I said this a couple times in the presentation, but even though the percentages themselves seem kind of low, like when it comes to liberal students and having difficulty expressing their views on campus, it's the sheer number and volume of students that identify as liberal means that that's a lot of students. And I think that's definitely been getting lost. Most of the coverage is either, right-leaning outlet, it's look at how bad things are, especially
Right.
for the conservative students, in outlets that want to, that have criticism of the findings or think that it's like a right-wing plot to make it look like that, campus is evil. Like
Right.
they're kind of maybe just they're criticizing, but they're also not making that point. And I think that's honestly, I really think that that's an important point. If the majority of students are identifying as politically liberal, and it's a lot of them in this data, and even 20% of them are having difficulty expressing themselves, I think that's a lot. And on some of these other items, it's higher than that. Like on some of the context items for liberal students, it's higher than 20%. I'm like harping on the self-censorship question, but I think that's one that really has been underreported. I think one we're all, somewhat, we're a little miffed about is how the violence question gets picked up by media on the right. It's the question asks, would you find it acceptable for students to use this tactic? So they're not being asked if they would get violent.
Right.
And it's not that they support it. They say it's acceptable do this? Like we would find this acceptable to do. And I think those are important distinctions.
Sure. Thank you. A question I've had come in, and a good question. Maybe you'll know, maybe it's something we can dig a little more into, but is there any correlation between the bottom performing schools in the rankings and their religious affiliation status?
So we haven't looked at that specifically. That's a very good question. And I think what I can give you is most of the warning schools are religious schools. And so they did poorly. And so I think there's likely something there, but right now that hunch is based on basically how most of the warning schools did, knowing that they are religious schools that effectively say they're placing their religious values above freedom of expression. But that's a great question, and we can go in and, I guess the thing is there's, how many other religious schools do we have in there that aren't warnings? I think we have a few, like Notre Dame also didn't do too well.
Yeah. Boston College.
So I think there's something
low.
to that, but we'd have to look into it.
Yeah, I know from the top lines, I know Boston College finished low, Marquette finished low,
Yeah.
DePaul finished low. I'm sure there are probably some that finished higher, but yeah, it's a good question.
It seems like there's something there for sure.
All right. We've had we're doing this, at this point, it's been a few weeks since we've had this survey out. We've had a little bit of time to ponder the results. We've had we've heard feedback from any number of directions. I'm curious to know, and you've presented on this in a number of different settings. Have you, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, maybe others at Fire have heard it, but has any of this translated into universities coming to us, university administrators wondering, looking for pointers on how they might improve their ranking? Obviously, administrative support for free expression, we've hammered this a little bit, is an area where they can make not low-hanging fruit gains, but where definite gains can be made. But have you seen this sort of translating into any desire for change and action from university administrators?
So happy to report, yes. We actually have a meeting scheduled next week with DePaul University's president. They want to chat about the survey and their policies that are on the books. And it sounded very cordial, and it didn't sound like it was going to be a we don't agree with this at all meeting. It seemed like an exchange where they effectively, what you just asked, Peter, it sounds like that is what that conversation is going to be about, is these would be policy recommendations that we would make. And we would hope that then this shows up in your findings next year, et cetera. On DePaul and like liberal arts colleges in general, it might make sense, just the way US News and World Report do it, to kind of break them out and only compare them to each other. And it might not be fair to be comparing them to these larger institutions that approach, they certainly approach the college experience, I think, differently. Like a large R1 university has 200, 300, 400 person lectures, and you're in a class with 20 people at a place like DePaul. So there's much more of a everybody could potentially know everybody factor at these smaller institutions, and it's probably a little unfair to compare them to the larger ones, like directly. And so it might be that's an idea I think that could be taken under consideration, is basically having a separate table for the liberal arts colleges.
Sure. You mentioned, definitely there was a lot more variety within the institutions that we surveyed this year. A lot more liberal arts thrown in, and it's sort of alluded to in one of your slides, but I think you mentioned some sort of some campus specific, some institution specific challenges to collecting good data on this. Could you maybe give an example or two of where we ran into that?
Oh yeah, so we rely on a survey panel company, and they have panels at a lot of universities. across the country. Their college student panel is over 500,000 students, current students, but they do not have panels at every campus. And there were a handful of schools where we didn't hit our desired sample size, but we felt that based on the sample size we got and the size of the student body, that it was sufficient. This was mostly at some smaller liberal arts colleges. So, we were targeting around 250 to 300 students at each school. So a school like Claremont McKenna has, like I mentioned, roughly about 2,000 students. So if we got 250 students from Claremont McKenna, that's like over 10% of the student body.
Right.
We got something around like 160, 170 for them or so, which I still think is very, very good, but it's certainly less than what we were targeting. We had a few schools that we had to make decisions while the survey was fielding that we needed to swap them out and target a different school that was going to be easier to survey, and that had a bigger panel in it. So that's something one thing, and especially if we do something where we're trying to measure and maybe even factor in student viewpoint diversity and how students in the minority experience the campus, we feel we would need to we probably need to survey more students than we're currently surveying to make sure on some of these campuses where the representation is pretty skewed, that we would actually have enough students who are in the ideological minority to actually do this. I can say that there are some schools there where it's basically the students were almost entirely liberal. And there were very few conservatives, a handful of moderates. And then there was one school where this was the opposite case, where it was like the student body went very conservative. And so at schools like that, we would need larger sample sizes to make sure we're getting students from the ideological minority. And so I think that's something we've discussed. It's something we want to potentially do going forward. Other factors are we've internally looked at what the margin of error would be on these different campuses by student ideology. We have the overall margin of error for each campus. Most of them are at about 5%. So that's in kind of the acceptable, like 4 to 8% range that a lot of these survey companies accept as good. Only a handful were outside that, and those were the schools that, like I mentioned, we didn't hit our sample size target.
Okay. Yep. This proposes, taking things in a completely different direction. So this is really just kind of a thought experiment, but with the, when it comes to our data sample for this, we have access to a very large student population. Is there something similar that would let us study these same things from the perspective of faculty? I know that every once in a while I will see, especially often in the context of a major controversy that's taken place. I've seen a number of academic senates, academic units, under their own initiative, pull their faculty on their views on academic freedom, how they feel about the right to dissent, how welcoming the environment is for that kind of thing. Would we think about doing some version of a project like this aimed at getting a sense of faculty opinion?
The short answer is yes, of course, and then there's like a but.
Right. I'm sure the but is
sizable enough. The but is, so backing up a little bit, College Pulse is our survey partner for the key reason that they can tell us which campuses these students are on.
Right.
We could go to YouGov, we could go to Qualtrics, we could go to any number of survey companies, even Gallup, which the Knight Foundation has done a number of times. They've partnered with Gallup to survey students, but none of those places can tell us where the responses come from because it's more of a national sample that then gets pulled. So similarly for faculty, this is actually even tougher to get because faculty are a harder to reach population than students are to survey. There are faculty surveys out there. There's a number that have been done in the US. Some of them are done by polling companies, and the reports have been released. There's also peer-reviewed papers which survey faculty and look at kind of not necessarily asking so much about academic freedom issues, but asking about viewpoint diversity and if they would discriminate against ideologically dissimilar colleagues. Surprise, surprise, they find that basically regardless of your ideology, you would.
Right.
Yeah, like professors admit that. I mean, not like obviously not every professor, but a notable portion do. But and I will say we are right now crafting a faculty survey, and we plan to collect data from faculty in early 22. However, that's going to be a sample collected nationally. Right. It wouldn't be tied to a specific campus. That's kind of that's the linchpin in terms of being able to factor that more into the rankings itself, I think.
Sure.
It would be getting a sufficient sample of faculty from each of these campuses, and that's probably pretty challenging. I think what the best, at least we can do right now, is what I think we have planned for early 2022 is like we're gonna collect a sample of probably something like 800 to 1,200 faculty members. The questions are going to ask about academic freedom. It's going to ask about their experience with expressing their views on campus, if they've self-censored. We're going to include a handful of questions from the student survey, so we can compare what faculty say to what students say on these items. But I think the dream of being able to do it in a way that we could say, oh, and based on the faculty responses on this campus, like this actually should be the score, that's still not feasible yet. We kind of hope it would be. I think it's as, if not more important than getting the student attitudes. And the reason I say that is the students are there for like 4 or 5 years at most, probably. Tenured track faculty could be at a university for decades, and they likely have a little bit more influence over how the campus operates and what kind of climate is set. So I think it's an important thing to obtain and do, but the best we can do right now is probably a national sample.
Great. Well, I look forward to seeing where that goes in early 2022. I'll stay tuned, and I'm sure plenty of people in our network are going to be interested to hear about that as well. You know, I'm sorry, we've still got a couple of good questions on the board, but we're just about at time. Sean, is there anything that you want to throw in for faculty? Any last pitches before we go for the day?
Yeah, well, I guess 2 things. So one is happy to address those final 2 questions, and we could just send it out in an email, final few questions, and we can send them out in an email to the attendees. Happy to do that. The other one is, like, we would love to hear from faculty that have ideas for what we can do with this. Like, as I keep saying, like this, we'd love to hear ideas for how else to leverage the data, how else to find things like, oh, this school is doing this program, like we should note that and maybe look at how this is impacting their score, things like that, if we can do that. So it's basically an open invitation to, if you have an idea for something we might be able to do with this data, we'd love to hear it.
Great. Well, Sean, thank you. And the last thing that I will throw in, I've put both of our emails in the chat. Anyone can follow up with me or Sean anytime. We're happy to hear from you. And as Sean has just said, we're very happy to take ideas on future lines of research and questioning from us. But I want to say thanks very much, Sean, for being with us. This was a great discussion. I'm really happy to be able to share this with our faculty. And we should be back with, I think, hopefully one more of these webinars before the year is out, and we'll continue with them right on up through the rest of the academic year. So looking forward to bringing more of this programming to our faculty. And Sean, again, thanks very much for taking the time this afternoon. Enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thanks for joining.